Hi, we're Closomat, the UK's only specialist manufacturer of wash and dry toilets. Every day, tens of thousands of people with a range of disabilities and medical conditions rely on us. It's what drives us in continuing to provide the highest quality products and the best customer care. We work closely with medical and clinical professionals to ensure our products offer the best possible combination of hygiene, dignity, and independence. We invented wash and dry toilets and have built up an unrivaled knowledge of meeting the needs of people with a range of disabilities and medical conditions. Many healthcare and clinical professionals specify our products every day, and tens of thousands of people have chosen us to help them with their intimate toileting needs. We manufacture our products in the northwest of England and have done so for over 60 years. Our products can be modified to suit individual needs, no matter how complex. Thanks to a combination of advanced engineering and high-quality materials, many of our products have been in service for over 40 years. We use our own engineers to carry out maintenance and repairs to ensure an expert is on hand right when you need it. If things change, our products can be easily adapted so that they continue to meet the needs of our customers. We offer a range of service options and annual maintenance plans to give the added peace of mind that they will provide many years of service. Together, it's why more people choose Closomat than any other wash and dry toilet.
Hello everyone, and welcome to the next webinar in our series with Closomat. This one based on cerebral palsy in the built environment and a reflection on accessibility. For any of you who were at our last webinar, which focused on a similar topic but around MS, you'll notice that we did it slightly differently. So we built in an interview with someone who lives with MS, and it was so well received getting that lived experience. We've done the same thing here. So you will hear an interview with a really inspirational person called Rachel, who some of you might also know, given that she's an occupational therapist, and she's going to talk about her experiences from childhood to adulthood in an educational, work, home, domestic environment. So it's really insightful, and I hope you enjoy it. So the learning outcomes for this webinar are to explore the etiology and epidemiology of cerebral palsy, to reflect on the occupational impacts of the condition, and to consider how adaptations to the built environment have impacted the life of someone living with cerebral palsy, namely Rachel. So for anyone on the webinar who is very familiar with cerebral palsy, then some of this might be a refresher, which is absolutely fine. For others who have not worked with somebody with cerebral palsy, then I try and cover the basics around the condition, as well as then leading into using Rachel's experiences and reflections of life and living with the condition, something that might be able to give all of us a bit of insight. And certainly it was incredibly insightful for me as the person interviewing and having that conversation with Rachel. So let's start with this. Cerebral palsy is the most common cause of childhood physical disability. So there's some key interesting facts here. So it affects 1 in 400 live births. So that's UK and globally. And it's non-progressive, but a lifelong neurological condition. And one of the things that's interesting for us here to start considering is that in some of the previous neurological focused webinars that we've talked about, those conditions have been or have often been progressive or degenerative. So how we've talked about future-proofing there is slightly different. What's interesting with cerebral palsy, given that it is non-progressive, is that how do we build our evidence base and our clinical reasoning to future-proof for a condition that doesn't change? And we talked to Rachel a little bit about that, and essentially about how although the condition doesn't change, she still ages as anybody else would, and therefore the impact of her cerebral palsy during different stages of her life have different impacts. It's an interesting conversation. There are different types of cerebral palsy, so spastic cerebral palsy, dyskinetic, ataxic, hypertonic, and mixed. So like lots of these conditions, cerebral palsy itself is an umbrella term that covers a variety of different specific CP diagnoses. So spastic cerebral palsy is the most common type, and it's characterised by stiff, tight muscles that make movement difficult. You might, as you will hear Rachel, you might not hear her use the word spastic cerebral palsy at all. She describes herself as having hemiplegia cerebral palsy. Some of that might be because of the connotation of the word itself, or it might be that people are just using the specific type within that. So diplegia is one type which affects the legs more than the arms, hemiplegia which affects one side of the body normally, and quadriplegia which affects all four limbs. Anyone who works in other neurological services or has worked in stroke services, say for example, I'm sure will be very familiar with those phrases. While we're on this slide, it also is worth touching on the word itself, because don't forget, like most medical terms, they derive from something Latin or Greek. So that the word spastic derives from the Greek word which means shortening, muscle shortening, or to pull towards, or uncontrollable shaking. It's society that creates different perceptions or different connotations to the word itself. So please don't be afraid to see that word or to use that word in a medical sense. Dyskinetic cerebral palsy, which involves a range of involuntary or uncontrolled movements that can be slow and writhing or jerky and sudden. Some of the most common characteristics with dyskinetic CP are things like variable muscle tone. So you can go from high tone to low tone, which makes limbs look very stiff and then very floppy. Facial or mouth control, so you might see people look like they're grimacing, or the jaw is moving in certain angles. Motor difficulties, so it can affect balance and being able to walk in a straight line, for example, because of the muscle tone. And you'd regularly see delayed childhood developmental milestones. Ataxic cerebral palsy, which affects balance and coordination, resulting in shaky or what people might think are clumsy movements and difficulty with fine motor skills. Hypertonic, which is classified by low muscle tone that causes a loss of strength and firmness, so it impacts muscle control and joint stability. So the person with hypertonic cerebral palsy is likely to need support with things like sitting posture, lying posture, standing posture, all the things that kind of create that core tone and strength. And mixed, which is a combination of symptoms from two or more different types. So cerebral palsy is a group of permanent movement and posture disorders. So like I've said earlier, as is the case with a number of neurological diagnoses, it's an umbrella term. So it covers a group of those permanent movement and posture disorders. It's caused by non-progressive disturbances to the developing brain, which is why it's a birth, childhood, lifelong condition. Presentations can vary considerably depending on which area of the brain is affected. And this is an example, so a very basic diagram example of where the damage to the brain is for each of the different cerebral palsy diagnoses, as well as their prevalence. So you can see there that spastic cerebral palsy is around about 77% prevalent, and the particular part of the brain where the development occurs, or the underdevelopment occurs, and then again through the various different types of diagnoses. So you can spend a bit more time yourselves if you like. I'm really keen to be hearing as much from Rachel as we can in this webinar, rather than me just talking about cerebral palsy itself. So some of these things are things that you can then go away, if you wish to, and explore in a bit more depth about. So what we're going to do now is hear the first part of Rachel's experience. Now, Rachel and I talked for about an hour, and clearly we can't get all of that into this webinar. I'm sure we'll be pulling out other bits from that interview for you moving forward. But for the purpose of the webinar, I've broken this into two distinct sections. Each are around about 6 minutes long, but are different experiences and different questions. So we're going to hear from Rachel's the first part of this interview, and then we'll do a bit of reflection on some of the things that Rachel talks about.
I'm Rachel Booth-Gardner. So in my professional life, I'm a lead occupational therapist. So I work for a mental health and learning disabilities trust in the northeast of England. I am the chair of the Northern and Yorkshire region for the Royal College of Occupational Therapists. I'm also heavily involved in something called OTalk, which is a platform that the Royal College of Occupational Therapy run. And then I'm also a founding member of an organisation called Able OT UK, which is an advocacy and network organisation for occupational therapy staff or students who have lived experiences of disabilities, neurodiversity or long-term health conditions. In my day life, so I'm a wife, I'm an auntie, I was born with cerebral palsy. The type of cerebral palsy I have is a right hemiplegia, so that impacts the right side of my body. So my understanding is that means that the brain damage, which normally happens kind of either during birth or whilst you're in the womb, affects the left side of my brain, because the left side of the brain kind of sends all the messages to the right side of your body. So my cerebral palsy mainly impacts my right leg and foot, so I've got quite poor range of movement, so I can't really do dorsiflexion and plantar flexion or kind of move it. It's kind of quite stiff, and I can sort of see my toes, and if I really think about it, I can move my big toe independently, but the others don't really move. My right hand, although it's got quite good range of movement, it's quite weak, so sort of holding things or opening things is quite difficult. I tend to walk with 2 sticks or my wheeled walker in the house, but outside of the house I use an electric wheelchair to get around. I can do stairs, but only one at a time, and I really have to think about it, so I can't have anything else in my hands. And because I'm not always aware where my right foot is in space, so I find coming downstairs harder than going upstairs, because I can see where my right foot is coming upstairs, but coming down is a little bit harder, so I need to make sure that I've got handrail on both sides. I also have dyslexia, and sometimes with cerebral palsy people do have learning disabilities connected. So I went to a mainstream primary school and a mainstream secondary school. Primary school was fine. I remember having a few things in place, like having extra help with changing for PE, but it wasn't until I went to secondary school that I noticed kind of the big difference. The day that we all got our letters about secondary school and what class we were going to go in, everybody else just got a piece of paper, and I got an envelope, and in my envelope I took it home. Well, actually my mum had picked me up and we were driving somewhere, and this was before mobile phones. Mum would open the letter, and then I remember that she jumped out to use a payphone to talk to the local authority, because what the letter had actually said was, "Oh, your daughter has cerebral palsy, so we don't want to send her to the mainstream school, we want to send her to a special school," without any kind of assessment of who I am and what I could do and what I could manage. So I suppose that was probably one of the first times that I really realised, oh, hang on, I'm different from my peers here, and the system is treating me differently because it's read a diagnosis on a piece of paper without actually meeting me or understanding me. So if I think back to kind of going to secondary school, so once I was allowed to go to a mainstream school after quite a lot of fighting, really, we did lots of things around what were the things that I needed, and my biggest concern was moving around a really large school at the time when it was bell time and you had to move to your next class when there were lots of crowds around. So I had a reasonable adjustment in place. There wasn't called a reasonable adjustment in those days, where I could leave each of my classes 5 minutes before the bell so I could get to my next class without there being a big crowd. There was a couple of places where there were like 2 or 3 steps where there wasn't handrails, so we went round and just made sure that the environment met my needs. And then kind of thinking about transferring to college and then university and education and like further education. So I was a statemented child at school, and that followed me through to college. The statement kind of gave the local authority things that they had to put in place. And some of that was around my dyslexia, but quite a lot of it was around the cerebral palsy. But nothing ever felt smooth. It always felt like, right, the next hurdle and the next conversation that we were going to have was a problem to solve rather than a person that has got lots of skills but might need to do something different. When you're living with a disability, you're constantly coming across barrier after barrier after barrier, and you're coming up with ways and solutions and how to manage them, but you're constantly having to tell people about them, remind people about them, give people insight into what it's like to be you, and that's exhausting.
So we'll end the first part of that video there. Like I say, there's another part of a similar length where we talk about some slightly different things. To edit the video, to get it into this time that we have, there is, like I've said a little bit earlier, there's so many amazing stories that Rachel talks about, which is just so inspirational. It was an incredible hour or so listening to her. But I'll reflect a little bit about what Rachel's told us so far. So she says she's got a right-sided hemiplegia cerebral palsy. So thinking back to our slide about the diagnosis, we can kind of understand what that means. And we could go back and have a look at the picture of the brain and work out where that comes from. And we could explore that in more depth should we wish. She said it mainly impacts her right leg and foot, and talked about how she's unable most of the time to lift a big toe, things. So from an activity analysis perspective, that obviously has an impact. So we'll be thinking about those things and how that might impact, say, some risks around falls or some issues around accessibility in relation to steps and stairs and thresholds and those sorts of things. She talked about how that means what kind of mobility aids she has and where she uses them. So Rachel has 2 or 3 different devices depending on what environment she's in. So we would need to be thinking about how that environment enabled her to be active and as independent as possible within those spaces. Rachel has dyslexia, which she says is a common link with cerebral palsy, and certainly within some diagnoses of cerebral palsy rightly states that there is a link there to some learning disabilities. She spent a lot of time, and you saw a snippet there in that first half of the interview, talking about the education process and how, as much as education and school was a really good experience for her in lots of ways, as she got older, she started to realise that there were times where she was labelled with cerebral palsy. And in the video she talked about the example of where she was told which school she was going to be going to, and it wasn't a mainstream school with her friends and peers. It was at the time what she describes there as going to a non-mainstream specialist school. Now Rachel's in a position where her mum's also an occupational therapist and advocated for her and fought for her, but as Rachel said there, that was exhausting, and we need to reflect on I would hope processes have changed, but given our work that we do around some supporting authorities with HCPs, there's still a lot of work to be done there. But if Rachel hadn't had her mum, Mary, in that role, and knowing that she could fight and advocate for her, Rachel's future actually would have been very different, or certainly could have been very different. But it was the first time she remembered feeling different. So she felt different because she'd been labelled. And she described some environmental and routine changes during education, as well as barriers that regularly impacted on accessibility. So it sounds in the conversations that I had with her that actually her schools, from a physical perspective, did quite a good job. So they did walk around the school environments with her to see if there were any areas she'd have some difficulty in, and then they would wherever they could, they'd make those adjustments and put physical things like rails in place for her. And they made some routine changes to make sure that Rachel was able to get around where she needed to. But what you didn't also see in that video was how Rachel talked about, whilst those changes were positive, they also were very likely to make her stand out. So how that was done meant that she left the class early, so she joined the next one early. It allowed her to walk through corridors when nobody was there, which in theory is a great idea. I'm not saying the school did anything wrong there at all, but you're also highlighting the fact that Rachel is different, in her words, to her peers, and again, psychologically, how that could make someone feel. So some of the barriers that Rachel identified, and I think for me this was my key reflection after meeting Rachel. When I was driving home, I was thinking that actually wasn't necessarily what I was expecting. It was my own, and that was through my own naivety, my own inexperience of speaking to someone with cerebral palsy. In that I expected, I think, particularly given the title of the webinar, that we were there probably to talk about physical barriers, and she does bring them up. So she reflected that they've often been easier to overcome than most circumstances. So she's used simple adaptations such as banisters, grab rails, heightened equipment. The chair that she was sitting on during the interview had chair raisers on, and they were all made in school and education. They all made school and education accessible. But she described the physical barriers actually being things she could overcome. But she talked at length about things like institutional and attitudinal barriers. And I don't know why I didn't necessarily think that they would be the main obstacles. Again, it was my naivety probably. But she talked at length about things such as statementing and the benefit system, workplace adjustments and challenges. She talked about how people perceived cerebral palsy as a childhood condition rather than lifelong. And so then when she became an adult, all of the support she received as a child and as a young adult just disappeared, and how she felt like she was left to fend for herself. Now, don't get me wrong, Rachel's incredibly capable of advocating for herself and fending for herself, and has a wonderful family and network around her to help with that. But she describes herself there in the first part of the interview that you saw as absolutely exhausting. She used examples and attitudinal around school uniforms. She gave me the example, which you haven't heard in the clip there, of when she was young at school. She wore calipers, and she couldn't wear calipers with the school uniform style shoes. She had to wear boots. And she said countless times she was stopped on a corridor by a teacher to say she wasn't wearing the right uniform. And when she explained that she had to wear boots because of the calipers, the responses were very non-committal, even though the school themselves and the head teachers and the people who knew her most accepted that that's exactly what Rachel needed. But all of those little things during a school day, thinking, am I going to get stopped on the corridor when I'm by myself, walking to a class that I need to get to, that I need to leave earlier because it takes me longer to walk there, and then think, am I going to get stopped because they think I'm wearing the wrong shoes when I'm not, and should that not have been communicated and agreed? All those things sort of added up for Rachel and built into things that were exhausting. And she talked a fair bit about attitudes towards PIPs, or personal independent payments, and that general lack of awareness that PIP is to support the extra costs that somebody has to pay for when they have a disability. So Rachel talked about how she has to charge her electric wheelchair, which uses more electricity. She has to buy a different, more expensive type of car to be able to access it. She has to do a lot more washing because she has bladder and bowel issues, which she told me in the recording, so it's absolutely fine to say. It just wasn't there in the clip that you've seen. So she says that social lack of awareness of what those benefits are for, especially when she works full time as a principal occupational therapist in a mental health setting, and people still now say to her, how do you get PIP when you work full time? And people just don't understand, and that creates these attitudinal barriers that she sees have a bigger impact on her on a daily basis than the physical ones. And that was something I felt it was really important to reflect on in terms of how my role as an occupational therapist, if I was supporting Rachel in my professional role, what would my starting point be? It would impact probably what her goals were and what she would like me to try and achieve for her. Where I thought they would probably be the physical barriers, they're absolutely not, in Rachel's case anyway. In a more general sense, why does accessibility matter? So it enables participation in meaningful and purposeful activity, with poor design of the physical environment amplifying the condition's presentations and creating disability. That's why we talk about the environment disabling someone rather than the person being disabled, and using that kind of language as more enabling language. So some core design considerations, and these are things based on experience, on documents like Approved Doc-M, on other kind of evidence-based documents, but also on Rachel's reflections. So certainly physical accessibility is a key one when you're designing the environment, and accessibility, thinking about things like floor type. Rachel talked about doorway widths, the use of her different devices, and how turning circles are incredibly important to her, how transferring from one side to the other, given her hemiplegia, makes a massive difference. Energy management, so ensuring that the person is using their energy as efficiently as possible, because Rachel talks about when things are inefficient, how she gets tired very quickly. Safety, so the majority of things Rachel talked about safety-wise were around falls and falls reduction, and there's a separate Closomat webinar on falls and falls recovery, and other elements of that within some of the webinars, such as the Parkinson's webinar and visual impairment webinar, so you can have a look at them on the website, and I'm sure someone will pop them into the chat there now for you. Cognitive and sensory support, so making sure that things are logically placed. The person is the expert in themselves, so where do they feel like things should be? That make, where do they see those things as being those sensible places for them to be? And remembering that depending on the type of cerebral palsy the person has, the presentations will be very different. So somebody who has very specific sensory needs might need things that don't produce glare. They might have visual impairment and therefore need to be thinking about task lighting and colour contrast. All of those different things come into these design aspects. Things that support dignity and independence, such as wash-dry toilets and shower and bathing spaces. Can you provide them that are accessible, but also where the person is able to complete the task themselves, or the majority of the task themselves, where dignity and independence can be maximised? And something like a wash-dry toilet certainly helps the person be able to manage those tasks with the maximum amount of dignity. And future-proofing, which is an interesting one, because like at the very beginning we talked about those, how cerebral palsy isn't a progressive degenerative condition. However, if that's the person's starting point and the body is going to continue to age like anybody else's would, then that will, as the person ages, that will highlight those conditions and the challenges that person has. So whilst we're all going to age, somebody who ages like Rachel with cerebral palsy, those challenges will become further emphasised, and therefore the risks will be of, say, Rachel falling when she's older will be far greater than there might be for me as we age. So we're thinking about future-proofing in the context of applying the cerebral palsy to natural ageing, and therefore how we future-proof would be very different for me to Rachel because of that condition, even though it isn't in itself degenerative. So we're going to jump straight into the part 2 of Rachel's interview, and again we'll do a bit of reflection afterwards.
My mobility has changed over time, but I bought this house 11 years ago, and when we were looking at places to live, what I wanted was something that could be not necessarily a forever home, but somewhere that I would live for a long time, but thinking about what adaptations it might need to be made. So for me, the hall needs to be big, because at one point I might need to put a lift in, or I might need to put a stair lift in so I could get upstairs, or I might need to live downstairs, so there needed to be 2 rooms that were big enough to accommodate that. And there has been 2 occasions in my life where I have lived downstairs for long periods of time after hospital admissions because I wasn't able to get upstairs. It's always the bathroom is the issue. I go to my dad's, he's got a downstairs toilet, so that's okay, but it's quite low. So I normally have to kind of push myself up on the back or get somebody to actually help me get out. So I think bathrooms would be, and actually when I think about work, so I access 2 bathrooms at work. One is the big accessible bathroom, which I can use quite independently. The other one is the toilet most close to my office, and it's literally 15 steps, so I'll use my walking sticks to get to it. And the toilet's not too bad. It's a bit higher than the average toilet, but I still need to pull myself up on the sink, which isn't a great design, and any OT will tell you shouldn't do that. First thing I talk to them about is that it's okay to say that you've got some difficulties and you're going to have to do that in order to get the support that you need, and to become, in a way, I suppose, sort of like quite thick-skinned around some of the negative experiences that you might come across, because unfortunately you are going to come across them, but to find a support network that is somewhere that you can go. And certainly I found within Able OT UK a network of people that I can go to and say, this is my lived experiences, and actually it's been really, really difficult. And there's groups of people that go, yeah, that happens to us as well. So you are able to kind of have that, I suppose, safe space that you can kind of air those things. But it's about being prepared for, unfortunately, a lifetime of having to advocate for yourself. And I think one of the things around cerebral palsy is it's very much seen as a children's disability, but it's not. It's a lifelong disability. So a lot of the mechanisms and services that are developed for children, and then as soon as you become an adult, you're suddenly like left to the wolves in a way. I think the biggest piece of advice that I'll give any occupational therapist is we've got all the knowledge and skills that come with understanding how we can change and adapt an environment. But I think sometimes we don't spend enough time in really understanding that individual's lived experience. So, and probably naively think about it in quite siloed experiences. So we'll think about can't get on and off of a toilet, so we'll get a piece of equipment to help with that. Or finding it difficult to get dressed, we'll sort out a bit of equipment or some coping mechanisms to be able to dress yourself, or get some help to dress yourself. But actually that wider element of, it's not just about the toilet and getting dressed, it's everything that happens in that day and the energy that it takes, and the fluctuation in somebody's ability to do those things. And they're the kind of conversations that I'd like people to be having, is tell me about your worst day, but also tell me about your best day, and let's talk about that fluctuation and what support and mechanisms can we put in place to help.
I don't know what everybody else will have picked out from that second video, but I'll share my own I think probably two key bits of reflection. The first was when I was in the room with Rachel, and the answer to the first question about what would she say to a child now with cerebral palsy, and her answer essentially was, become thick-skinned, learn how to fight because you're going to have to, learn how to advocate for yourself because you're going to have to. I found that quite difficult. If knowing Rachel as I do, I think I was probably expecting, again, naively, some sort of inspirational message there. And actually what we got was the reality. It was Rachel saying, learn how to fight, learn how to deal with negative perceptions, learn how to advocate for yourself. And that's from somebody who can advocate for themselves. What about someone with cerebral palsy who can't communicate what they want or what they'd like to happen or what they need? And therefore, who properly advocates for them? So that was my first bit. It was a real reality check. And that's something I think we can support change with when we're working in schools, or working in the community, or we're working in a hospital environment with a child or an adult with cerebral palsy, is understanding their fight. And as occupational therapists, what questions we can ask and how we can support them with that fight. What positive, active change can we make? Or how can we make sure that our interaction with that person isn't as it has been with everybody else? And the second thing was Rachel is incredibly inspirational. So Rachel is someone who has defied the labelling of a neurological condition like cerebral palsy. She started a master's last week. She's a principal occupational therapist in a large mental health trust. She is independent. She is an active participant in her family, and one of the things she said, and what makes it even more hard hitting is it's actually the same thing Matthew said in the last MS webinar. Was when I asked what they would like us to do, they essentially said, be client-centered, know us, ask us the right questions, think about not just the doing, but think about us personally. So they both essentially said be client-centered is something they would tell us to do. But we profess to be a client-centered profession. So if two people with two neurological conditions have said the same thing to us, then we need to reflect on practice. We need to reflect on, rather than saying that we're client-centered, are we? And how are we? It's not just a line to throw away in a definition of our profession. It has to be the core element of what we do and achieve in collaboration with someone we work with. I think because it was the second time it had been said in a matter of months in a webinar like this, it just made me reflect on, if it needs to be said, then maybe we need to take a step back and look at ourselves professionally a bit more. You might have picked out completely different things, but they were my reflections, and I thought they were important to share. But certainly what Rachel's told us is accessibility is more than mobility or more than physical access. So it means accessible processes. Rachel talked off the camera there, on camera, but not within the clips, around application processes for her PIP and how often she needs to do that. And how some of the systems within that aren't particularly accessible. It's thinking about the education process, and when Mary, her mum, was applying for different schools, how that process was relatively inaccessible and they were told what was going to happen until Mary fought for it. So accessible can't in that context just be about the physical environment. The processes by which people engage with us and our services have to also be accessible, and that doesn't just mean having leaflets or brochures in different language or font or braille, or it means accessible to everyone, regardless of what their needs or characteristics are. It's ensuring that attitudes don't impact opportunity. So again, not labelling, making sure that the person isn't labelled with a condition. And actually for occupational therapists, that should be fairly straightforward, because we're not condition focused, we're not part of that medical model. Understanding diagnoses and condition is really important as part of our evidence base, but it's the person themselves that we're focusing on, isn't it? And it's organisational culture, that facilitates or indeed disables. And even from a physical perspective, it's not just about the person using a wheelchair, where rightly I would suggest we're thinking about DocM design as being the basic minimum standards, and I absolutely do mean the minimum standards, because I think even some of those dimensions are starting to look a little small. So things like someone with a visual impairment, and I touched on that briefly earlier around understanding light reflective values and colour contrast and all those other things that you can find the information on in different webinars. They make spaces accessible to someone with that visual impairment, making them accessible to someone with a cognitive impairment, again, which you can use colour contrast for, or you can use labelling and pictures to symbolise certain areas or spaces. But those sorts of things make them truly accessible. And thinking about the life roles of the person, so what might be accessible, what needs to be accessible for somebody who is a parent with or without a registered disability will be very different for somebody who is using a walking aid or an electric wheelchair. For if something's a communal space that is labelled as accessible, it's that move, isn't it, from disabled toilets to accessible toilets in public spaces. Because the inanimate object can't be disabled, but the environment can absolutely be disabling. So thinking about the type of person that's going to use a particular space, if it's in a domestic environment, and the person is of working age and has a young family, the space that you might design for that person or support the person in designing might be different to somebody who is a post-retirement and engages in activity in a different way. And really that last bit of reflection is, how would we support Rachel? Now that we've heard what she's said, how would we support her? If you were going to see Rachel tomorrow as her occupational therapist, what would you do for her? How would you do it? And having a bit of a reflection about whether what you've heard might change what you would have done yesterday. Because it's the reflection that's important. So Rachel challenges us to consider the person as a whole, listen to the person's lived experience, to advocate, to focus on strengths as much as weaknesses. She challenges us to be occupational therapists, and I think that's what I was trying to get to in my initial reflection, is actually what she's challenged us to do and be. It's just what we were trained to do and be. And often we profess to be. Whether we're doing it in that way is for you to decide. I hope you've all found that useful and interesting. There's some resources there that I used in putting this together that you'll be able to access when you're sent the presentation. There's some really good support guides on there. Rachel is absolutely inspirational, and she tells us that regardless of diagnosis or label, anything can be achieved with the right advocacy, with the right support, with the right reduction of barriers, whether they be attitudinal, physical, societal, or anything else. So now we'll come back live and answer any questions that we haven't been able to answer in the chat, or to talk about some themes and a bit more reflection should we need to. Thank you. We're repeatedly asked as clinicians, but also when we're providing Closomat with clinical support, about that issue of compatibility.
And I don't know what you think about this, but compatibility seems to have become a question about what goes over the toilet.
Absolutely.
Whereas actually it's a bigger issue than that, isn't it?
Yes.
Because if we're thinking about the long-term management of somebody's needs, the term compatibility, if it's just about it going over the toilet, if that affects the outcome or it reduces the effectiveness of the product that was there in the first place, could be counterintuitive.
Yes, absolutely.
So we need to start asking a bit more about that. So yes, it's obviously incredibly important of what goes over it in terms of long-term future-proofing, but we need to be asking questions about the douche length and positioning, how the water flows from that, what the water pressure is, you know, how does something going over the toilet affect the outcome, and making sure that compatibility actually means something that it supports the functional outcome.
Absolutely.
Do you have that shared experience?
Yes, it's a question that I'm asked a lot about compatibility. Does this shower chair go over the toilet? And like you say, there's so much more to than just being able to place a shower chair or commode chair over a toilet. We need to think about that person. Are they getting clean? Like you say, that the water pressure, is it high enough? Because when you're sitting on a shower chair, you could be 4 or 5 inches above where you would be normally. So we have to ask questions. As occupational therapists, we have to be really critical thinkers and not just accept that this is compatible because it fits over, but actually look at the product and say, is it cleaning this person effectively? Are they still maintaining their independence when they're using the wash-dry toilet? So that's a really important point about compatibility. And like I say, it's about evaluating a piece of equipment and evaluating a product and using those critical thinking skills that I think we all have to say, is this going to work for the person? Are we going to get the most effective outcomes?
Yeah, no, it's really important.